For product longevity to thrive, we need new business models and new design strategies and probably a new economy. What does business as unusual look like, and how do we design for it? You can join the discussion on Twitter, of course. Now, Nancy and Paul, you both have looked at disruptive business development. Nancy, you have an interesting startup company called Homey. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so sure. So 2 years ago we started the idea of Homey. So Homey is a pay-per-use business model. So there's a lot of literature saying that pay-per-use might be better from an environmental perspective. But we actually wanted to test whether this was really the case. So through a pay-per-wash business model, so we started with washing machines, we started to test whether we could actually create a circular business model as well as sustainable consumption. So first of all, we want to check whether we can actually make a product that can be reused and maintained and repaired much more easily. And we also want to actually stimulate sustainable consumption. So through paying per use, we actually want to help customers reduce the number of washes they do. And we also, through differential pricing, help them actually lower the washing temperature at which they wash. And we gathered early evidence, and at this conference, the Plate conference, I just presented something about it. And we can actually see that consumers wash less when they pay per use, and also they wash at lower temperatures through the interventions that we do. So it's actually a really big experiment around circular economy and pay per use and sustainable consumption through one business called Homey. And it's called Homey because we don't only want to focus on washing machines, but actually all appliances in the home.
And which geographic regions did you do that?
We started in the Netherlands, but we're also exploring Germany now as a market. And while I'm based in Sweden at the moment, we think that Sweden could have a lot of potential because Sweden has apartment blocks with shared washing machines. So potentially it could be a very good market for us.
Great. Yeah. Paul, you have looked at the implications for car durability if we move to electric vehicles. What lesson can we learn from your experience? Will these new developments stimulate product longevity and sustainability?
Well, the problem with electric vehicles is that the more you electrify a car, the more you have embedded carbon in it. So with traditional cars, about 20% of the lifetime impact of a car is in its production. But with electric vehicles, that can actually go to over 50% of the lifetime impact, which changes completely the equation. So the model we've got at the moment, whereby you get rid of a car traditionally the average car life expectancy in Europe is about between 12 and 14 years, roughly. So with this, you would really need to double the lifespan. The research that's been done on the embedded carbon so far says, well, we just have to have less carbon in it, but that's inherently in the technology impossible. So the only answer to have is go for a much longer lifespan. Now, fortunately, the maintenance sensitivity of electric cars is lower than internal combustion engine cars. In the UK, we used to have an industry that made milk floats, electric milk floats for milk delivery early in the morning.
Long time ago.
Indeed, because people didn't want to be woken up by a diesel engine outside their door at 4 a.m. In South Wales, where I'm based, we used to have an industry that made them, and the industry disappeared because there was no replacement demand, because they lasted a very long time. And I talked to some of the last people using them, and they said, well, occasionally we changed the brushes in the motors, occasionally we changed the batteries, they were lead-acid batteries, but that's all we need to do. And again, going to Norway, where they run a lot of electric cars, talking to people what's needed there, they said, well, we take the cars in and we stand around a bit, we look at the steering and brakes, but that's about all we need to do. So it's far less maintenance to do. So it's an ideal scenario to then say, all right, we have this new technology, we can go for a much longer product lifespan for the car now.
And therefore you could sell the cars as a service, and then you take the fashion out, put the function in, and then the cars can be used even if they are 20, 30 years old, because an electric motor has a 100-year technical lifespan. Now, is the carbon, what you said about the carbon content, is that true also for hydrogen fuel cell electric cars or only for the battery?
Well, this is specifically battery electric vehicle technology. We haven't looked at the hydrogen one, but my suspicion is that it would be less in the case of a hydrogen fuel cell. But we haven't looked at that. It's specifically the battery technology we've looked at.
Because Japan is going for hydrogen, and Norway now also wants to push the hydrogen, and that definitely would create a completely new, innovative drive into research.
Certainly where you have a lot of, say, hydroelectricity, where you can use the electricity to extract hydrogen from water, that's quite a good solution. And as you're probably aware, in Germany they've also talked about the excess energy generated by wind generators. Why not turn that into hydrogen and run hydrogen cars on that? So yes, you're right, hydrogen is still there knocking on the door behind the battery electric vehicle and could change that picture.
Now, in both cases, you basically increase the sustainability through longer use of the products. In the clothes washing, do you encourage your clients to use cold cymes? Because then you can actually wash with cold water. And is that accepted by the clients?
Yeah, so in our example, we actually do differential pricing. So the cold wash is something like €1, and the hot temperature wash, like 90 degrees, is something like €2. So we use differential pricing to stimulate certain behaviors. We also give advice and informative mailings to the customers. We also do social comparisons and tell them, like, look, your neighbor washes at this temperature. Should you also not use a lower temperature? So we use all kinds of behavioral science techniques to influence behavior, and we see that it's working, but particularly the pricing works. We do have young families as part of it, so they actually sometimes don't believe that a cold wash can be effective. Also for the maintenance of the machine, it can sometimes be good to run a high temperature cycle to clean the machine. So we also give away a free 90-degree wash every now and again.
Every Christmas.
Every Christmas we give them a free wash. So there's all kinds of things that we're working with, but as I said, it's one big experiment and we're gathering the data, but it's really exciting to be testing all those things.
But in both cases, the interesting thing is disruptive technologies, disruptive innovation, which needs a systems approach. You can no longer focus on producing mass-produced item that then disappears somewhere in nature.
Yes, maybe briefly commenting on the washing machine example. We started very simply with a demonstrator here at TU Delft. Like, we bought a washing machine that we could hack and we connected it to the internet. So we didn't develop a new washing machine. In an ideal case, you would redesign the whole product, make it suitable for remanufacturing, recycling, and that would be your product. But for us, it was more about testing the business model and seeing how to make it viable. And in the future, we would have to partner up maybe with banks to make the leasing model more viable, with washing machine manufacturers, maybe with mobile phone connectors to make it better connected. So there's all kinds of things that we could think about, the whole system, but it's one big experiment.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy and Paul. Now, Emma and Stella, you have both looked at the barriers and opportunities for new business models that support product longevity. Stella, what are the barriers and opportunities when we look at promoting product longevity in complex global supply chains?
Well, my research has focused on the fashion industry, which is where my background and experience lies. And the research that I've presented at this conference kind of focuses on a case study where we looked at a particular issue that had been raised by customers of a small cashmere company, the Cashmere Sweaters. And this is quite a common occurrence in the fashion industry, that issues with actually maintaining product quality in production, even though you've got a product that's designed to last a long time. You've got a specification, you've got it designed for durability. There do problems arise during that production process quite often, where managing the consistency of the product in production to that standard can be problematic. And there needs to be a sort of an approach in place for actually finding out why the problem's happening and then finding solutions to that problem. So in this case, the case company was quite a small knitwear retail brand. It had a lot of the processes within its supply chain were in-house, so it had quite a lot of control, but there was one part of the process that was outsourced. There was a lot of knowledge within the retail brand about why that problem might be happening, but there was a lot of reluctance between the retail brand and the outsourcing company in terms of trying to pinpoint where that problem was, and a lot of that was actually down to some of the kind of issues around trust, relationships, and actually being able to have the technical knowledge to sort of pinpoint where this problem was happening. And this is just an example of quite a simple process that had gone wrong, because it was actually found in the end through the extra testing that we did on behalf of this cashmere company, that the issues were within the outsourced part of the process. And actually, although that was quite easy to find in the end, it sort of points to the fact that for more complex products, like for instance the suit jacket you're wearing, which has lots of different components, goes through a lot more processes than a cashmere sweater would, that the opportunities for things to go wrong are much greater. And some of the supply chain research that we've done in terms of best practice around all of this area suggests that there are certain principles that need to be in place for some of these issues to be kind of resolved more easily. So it's things like having a sort of shared values between the retail brand and the manufacturer, having a sort of conducive relationship to resolving issues, so being able to share knowledge and sort of find solutions in a kind of methodical way. The adversarial relationship that sometimes exists between fashion retail brands and their supply chain because of the pressure on price and speed to market can kind of undermine some of that knowledge sharing and sort of problem resolution. And then added to that, you've got the complexities potentially of globally diverse locations where parts of your products are being sourced from or manufactured. And then you've also got sort of differences in business culture, management systems, understandings of, quality control systems that might be, in the UK industry, we had a specific approach to managing those things. As we've, sort of moved our manufacturing to developing countries, the approaches have been very different, maybe craft-based rather than technology-based or management science-based.
Cultural differences,
language barriers, even just things like, sort of just normal behaviour around trust and relationships, and not wanting to blame or sort of find fault, and how that is received by certain cultures and certain by people in certain countries. So although it was quite a simple problem that we uncovered, it sort of raised a lot of other issues about how some of these problems are exacerbated by the global supply chain. And actually, supply chain simplification is one of the sort of proposed ways to get round some of those problems. And also, from my own perspective of having worked in the industry myself, there is a huge amount of knowledge still around that isn't being utilised really or developed further that could help some of these issues sort of become managed in a better way.
Fascinating. Emma, you have argued that we need business strategies of sufficiency. What does that mean, and how can we promote this, and how can we make it happen?
That's $1 million question, isn't it? I don't have the absolute answer. I think what's really interesting about sufficiency, if you take it to its sort of logical level of thought, is that it actually questions what we do today. And I think it drives us to think about perhaps different values in the system that aren't purely driven by the economic imperative. And so if we're thinking about resource flows that are not only circular, but also around a sufficiency rationale, we're also talking about less stuff moving through the system, which raises lots of interesting questions about how does business operate, what sort of business models will emerge, how does business as unusual actually manifest in that context. And the research we've been looking at, I suppose, has not answered that question, unfortunately, but has perhaps begun to say, well, how do we begin to understand what this reality might be? How can design play a role in that? And we were looking at a part of a funded project in the UK was looking at the relationship between redistributed manufacturing, data, different levels of data collection, and circular economy, and thinking about how do we explore ideas of sufficiency within this sort of tri-paradigm, if you like, of these things coming together. What we were looking at, particularly in the project I've been reporting on at Plate, is understanding where people play a role in ideas of localised, more redistributed making. And we were looking at both consumer durables and fast-moving consumer goods. The one we've been focusing on in Plate has definitely been looking at sort of cultures of repair and trying to understand what motivates people to bring products, consumer durables, to repair cafes. You know, what constitutes brokenness? How do they perceive functionality? What makes them want to repair and replace and refurbish products rather than just buy a new one? And it was those sorts of questions we were trying to get at in order to develop scenarios which might begin to help us frame new research projects which can perhaps have more of a sufficiency basis to them.
Well, you know, the million-dollar question is not necessarily an obstacle. The European Commission has just spoken $1 billion for the next 2 years, the Horizon 2020, on specifically on research of the circular economy. So maybe you should try your luck.
I think, though, Walter, I think one of the things is, so we can have, and this is the important difference, I think you can apply circular thinking within business as usual, but as soon as you start trying to frame business as unusual and trying to think about what happens if you're not making so much stuff, you know, what are we saying if we want less stuff overall, as well as circular stuff? And this becomes a really political issue.
Yeah.
But I think it's a really important question that we need to afford care to, because these are the things that I think creative minds, designers should be applying themselves to, as well as the stuff that goes into those systems. We need much more creativity, I think, at the systems of strategy and policy to consider how those systems may exist, how well-being and wealth have been amalgamated under the current notion of economic flow, and we perhaps need to understand other ways and other values that are also valid in this process, and how the global north balances its own use of resources compared to an emerging consumption paradigm from the global south.
We are talking about disruptive innovation.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Emma and Stella. Now we have been joined by Ruud and Niels. You both come from technical background. What would you say are the technical barriers and opportunities for the creation of business models and product designs that support longer lasting products? Who would like to start?
Okay, I kick off. I think that you have not just a list of barriers and opportunities. It is in the end very much dependent on how technology is used and not the technology as such. I think a number of things that Emma mentioned. People think quite easily that emerging technologies like 3D printing, like Internet of Things, might enable that type of thinking. And they might indeed. They have the potential to go to local production, to enable repair when needed. With data management, you can obtain information that will allow more effective recovery, recycling, refurbishment, but only when we apply it in the right way. So I think that's where one of the big challenges will be. And there I also immediately see a kind of obstacle, because we make many, many products electronic in nature. And we do it in a way in which we embed the electronics inside the product. This means that it will be harder to have access to them. It will be harder to repair them. And this morning at Plate we had an interesting session where actually Niels discussed the importance of modularity. And that's actually what is lost when we would operate in that way. So we have to think about ways how to, on the one hand, exploit the opportunities that the technology offers, but we still don't know how we can avoid the potential drawbacks.
Niels, what is your approach or attitude or opinion?
Maybe I can just take up that with the modularity is one approach which has the potential. And again, like Ruud said, the potential can be used for good, but potential can also go wrong and be used for bad things in the future. So how do we differentiate that? It's always this potential which is ahead of us, but we don't have enough scientific knowledge to really make the decision on which is the right path. And then connecting that to what Paul said earlier, when we look at electronic products in our case, so microelectronics, we have a lot of the environmental impact is embedded in the production, in the product before it comes to the market. So we have to make the most use of that and then make use of that embedded carbon in a very flexible way by different users, but also by different companies. And that should be the future for circular economy for electronics. But that necessitates that we have modules which can be used across manufacturers even. So there must be ecosystems of companies. And they can be small companies who would then have the same kind of logic in the middle as the compute core is the same, but the rest of the product is, of course, totally individual and different. And so we think that for the last 20 years, maybe, electronics has been developing so fast that was an obstacle to reuse and to having such a solution. But now electronics is so highly integrated that finally we come to this case where an electronic module, which is a cubic centimeter in size, is a full computer. So that's the module we are looking at for the future.
So that means that modular design has to go hand in hand with component standardization. And then the next step is that these components should be reprogrammable or upgradable. And I know that Intel is looking into producing reprogrammable microchips. Of course, then we have another problem that you can technologically upgrade your existing computer. That's Intel will still earn some money, but the computer manufacturers will be out of the game. So isn't that going to provoke a reaction to speed up the fashion and all the model changes because computer companies, either they start selling goods as a service, or they will lose out in the game if electronics becomes more durable.
So if you think in this one direction, you could have a mass producer producing the modules, and many, probably smaller and local manufacturers doing the actual product, which of course in terms of then product regulation, product responsibility will also be a headache. But that's kind of with the 3D printing possibilities and all that, if you put that together, that is one route which could lead you forward. That would mean that the traditional computer manufacturers indeed lose business. But it doesn't have to be that way. It could also be that they are still the companies who produce the prime products, and the smaller companies are actually the ones reusing it for other purposes. Because the modularization also has this very nice side effect that you can upgrade when you need it. So you don't have to put all the compute power in the beginning, but when you need it. And that's one of the things where, again, it has to work across company boundaries. That's the limitation in the business model so far. That's where the clash comes from.
It would also create new business opportunities, because decentralized companies that can check the quality of the used components in order to guarantee the quality, the
Exactly.
usability.
So a standardization is, you said standardization of components. For us, that's already a small system which is standardized. So the interfaces have to be stable. The internals can change and can come from different manufacturers, but the interfaces have to be stable, yeah?
Ruud, would you like to?
Don't we try now to fit the development in the current economic system, actually? So when it is disruptive, you can expect some large changes for particular players in the field. I think the most important thing is to start thinking about how to take recovery at whatever level, whether it's a reuse, refurbishment, parts harvesting or recycling, into account in the early design stage. Companies that can fulfill that will remain in business. Companies that can't might have a problem.
Well, if we want to decouple economic growth from resource throughput, and this is a definite now political aim, then it's obvious that all the economic actors that are active either in the mining manufacturing chain or in the waste recycling chain will have a reduction in their business volume and therefore should focus their activity on optimizing the use of their products rather than the manufacturing. But that's a mental change that has only started in some businesses so far.
Yeah, but then you, for instance, take a Belgian company like Umicore. They started as a mining corporation. They now have a very strong focus on recycling.
Absolutely.
So you see that such a transition is possible.
They use the urban mine, to use the slang, but the expense of building this facility was 1 billion euros. So it means not only change in mind, it also means finances and a new approach to business, new take-back logistics, and new technologies, because in a smartphone, for example, you probably know that you have 70 chemical elements from the periodic table, of which Umicore at the moment can
17.
recover 10%. So there is still a huge knowledge and research gap that hopefully somebody will tackle.
Yeah, and it also shows, of course, that we should strive to use things on a functional level and not go back to the materials, because then it's almost unavoidable that you will have losses.
Absolutely.
But also the recycling end, maybe, I mean, it will still continue. So even if you have longer product use and longer living products, you will have to have a very good recycling. It's not the preferred mode anymore for value recovery, because you want to have the closer loops, but the last loop is still a very important aspect. So recycling will actually not disappear or have that large of a business problem, but of course on the primary material side there, they will have less business.
Well, for me, what differentiates the reuse of products from the recycling of materials is the second law of thermodynamics that you have just mentioned, and the fact that it's easier to make profits with reused goods than with recycled materials. Gentlemen and ladies, thank you very much for being here, and with this we will close the DIF live session, the second one, and return to the Plate conference. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks.